So welcome everyone. I apologize. Working remotely today, they're doing some work on the lines outside, so it makes the internet connection kind of dip for a minute or two. So it's good to be back online. Doing webinars is always a different task. I love seeing people. I love interacting with people, and just kind of getting to see faces and names. But today we're going to cover Addiction 101, the fantasy world of sports and gambling. And it's really interesting when we talk about what's going on around the nation when it comes to gambling, because last year, and I can't believe it was a year ago, we had the North Carolina Conference, which was fantastic. Loved presenting with Julie and with Cam. And we talked about gaming and we talked about sports betting. And at the time, sports betting was relatively new in New Jersey. So we're going to have some updates to that. And we're going to talk just about level setting. First, we're going to talk about the types of gamblers and connection with substance use. And then at a high level, I just want to kind of go over fantasy sports, esports, and video gaming, skill-based gambling, and some of the sports betting and emerging trends and responsible gambling. My hope is that in the next, say, 40, 45 minutes or so, we'll be able to cover a lot, leave you wanting more information. You can access our website at 800gambler.org. Many of you have my contact information directly. If not, you can reach out to Robbie. He's happy to supply that. And Robbie, that's okay to give people my contact information if they do want to chat further. So let's first take a look at just the brain, gambling and dopamine. You know, when we talk to people who are perhaps in the substance use field, we talk about injecting a substance into a body and how it changes chemistry, physiological changes, as well as brain chemistry changes. But what's unique about gambling is that you don't need to inject anything. Gambling changes the brain. It produces dopamine. It produces change in the body. And so here's a chart from Brain Briefings in 2007. And you can see that when dopamine is released when you're expecting a gain or a win, it's not released when you're expecting a loss. And other charts will also show that the brain actually is impacted the same way in a gambler as it is in someone who struggles with cocaine use. Similar areas light up when you look at charts and brain scans. So we know that you don't need to put a drug in your body in order to feel differently. And what's interesting about gambling, it's now been 7 years since DSM-5 actually named gambling the only non-substance related disorder. So that even goes to show that gambling is powerful. And Dr. Rugel said it best. She says gambling is the one addiction that has, for people who struggle with gambling addiction, it's that thing that can change your life. Gambling has the power to change someone's life in an instant. When you hit a Powerball, when you hit a big jackpot, something along those lines, it can be life-changing. For some people, it can take them out of poverty. It can make them feel as if they matter again. So it gets to a deeper level of how a person identifies themselves or how they see their standing, their social standing, their surroundings. It can take them out of poverty. So gambling is that thing that's so difficult to give up. Now, most people can gamble for fun and occasionally, and they have limits. They're social gamblers. That's more than 90% of Americans gamble socially. What's ironic is that, we're having this workshop, this webinar today, and it's March. March is nationally recognized as Problem Gambling Awareness Month. And so in New Jersey, we're encouraging people to have a conversation just about gambling. What type of gambling does a person do? How often do they gamble? The more we can have a conversation about something, the more the stigma around that topic is reduced. And gambling has long been viewed as a moral shortcoming. If someone had a gambling problem, they were encouraged to just simply stop. Person could be asked, why are you greedy? Why do you just want all this money? But what we know about a person with a gambling addiction, it's not about greed. It's not about money. They're typically looking for action or escape. Perhaps they're using the gambling as an outlet because they have a problem that they don't know how to deal with, or they don't have the right tools. They don't know where to begin. So it's not so simple as just stopping. So when we look at social gamblers, as I identified, more than 90% of people can gamble responsibly within limits. Then you start going down along a continuum to the serious gambler. They want to make sure they get their gambling in on a regular basis. It's a hobby, but they're still sticking to limits. For some, they turn to professional gambling. If you looked at their resume, it might actually indicate they were a professional gambler for a season of their life, or it's something that they'll add in as a job. They view it as a job. They have limits, but they're also doing it a lot more often. That can get a little tricky because some professional gamblers can find the way to becoming a problem gambler. Now, a problem gambler typically starts to have difficulty in different areas of their life. It could be relationships, it could be financial, it could be many different areas. DSM-5, as I mentioned before, has criteria, diagnostic criteria, 9 different items. And typically, if a person's answering yes to a certain number, say 4 or more, then they start to fall into the mild, moderate, or severe category of problem gambling. A disorder gambler is someone who is who's answering yes to 7 or more under the DSM criteria, and there's major life problems. Obviously, this is an individual that we do want to really help immediately. Self-exclusion, meetings, therapeutic intervention, many different ways. And then you have kind of along the lines of problem and disorder gambling is the antisocial gambler. Gambling as a way to manipulate others and total disregard for rules. So we talked about gambling as the hidden addiction. And I always mention that if you give it a urine screen to a gambler, you're not going to find anything. No one's going to pee dice. There's nothing coming out of a body. You can't find a problem gambler through a simple physical screen like you can with drugs or alcohol or the breathalyzer or what have you. So gambling is hard and difficult to diagnose. It's also hard to overcome because one of the interesting features of gambling is that every so often you actually do win something. You may not win much, but the power to win is addictive. And so with gambling, with that intermittent reinforcement, every so often you will win. The problem is threefold. You don't know how much, you don't know when, and you don't know how often. And it's those 3 things that almost become the hook of gambling. Because when you do win, that little dopamine is released and it feels really good. And when you don't win, but you're very close to winning, maybe you just had a near miss, maybe there was you're playing a slot machine, there's a couple of jackpots and you just missed the 3rd jackpot. That near miss is also very addicting. That dopamine gets released as the reels are stopping and you're seeing the potential payout, and then you get nothing. So there's a lot to gambling that keeps people hooked and reinforced. So what are the reasons for disordered gambling? Well, people gamble oftentimes to escape, but if you keep gambling to escape, and then you continue to go back to that thing that allows you to escape life, it's an escape from day-to-day problems and stress. Gambling, just like drugs and alcohol, could be a solution to a problem. There's a country band, Midland, that I love to listen to country music. And one of the lines of their song is called, the name of the song is Drinking Problem. And one of the lines says, people say I've got a drinking problem. I don't have a problem drinking at all. And that's true. And then the next line of that song, they call it a problem. I call it a solution. And for people who struggle with substance use disorder or gambling disorder, oftentimes it's the solution to a deeper problem. They could have depression, anxiety. It could become a coping strategy to deal with these things, or it could also have brought on the depression and the anxiety. So there's no simple answer. Each person on a case-by-case basis might gamble for different reasons. But a couple of the big factors, what we found over time, 2 predictors of developing a gambling problem is 1, age of onset, and number 2, experiencing a big win early. So you see the positives without seeing the negatives. And that applies also to substance use. When you have a developing brain and you introduce alcohol, drugs, or gambling at a very early age, and you don't see the negative side effects, well, now that person can be at a higher risk to develop a problem. Some of the risk factors to include, we have to factor in trauma. We have to take a look at adverse childhood experiences and understand an individual's journey through their life. We have to understand if there's pre-existing substance use, personality traits, and as I mentioned, the age of onset. So let's take a look here a little bit at the first topic to cover today, fantasy sports. It's so funny when you think about fantasy sports because the big debate was, is it a form of gambling? Is it not gambling? And the fantasy sports companies like FanDuel and DraftKings would tell you that it was not gambling. This was, confirmed by an MIT professor back in 2015-ish, who was given a bunch of data from FanDuel and was asked to analyze the data and asked to arrive at a conclusion as to whether fantasy sports contests constitute gambling. This was interesting because FanDuel supplied the data and also made mention that there's a lot riding on this decision and determination. This particular individual determined that fantasy sports was more skill than risk, so therefore it was considered a skill-based form of entertainment, and it did not fall under gambling law for about half the states in the United States, New Jersey being one of them. Ironically, now in the last month, New York State is reviewing fantasy sports again, and they are now looking to consider it a form of gambling, which at this point is a moot point, because now that sports betting is legalized around the country, state by state, they're moving along that path. If fantasy sports is considered a form of gambling, it really doesn't matter because the sports gambling laws in a lot of the states will now support it anyway. So we have to understand first what is fantasy sports. For those of you on this webinar today that may not be aware, fantasy sports contests were originally called rotisserie contests. And back a long time ago, participants would be in a league. They would assemble an imaginary team using real players. So there'd be a draft, and we would come together and we would draft our players. And the most popular forms of fantasy leagues are football leagues, fantasy football leagues, because those are played once a week. So you don't have to pay as much attention on a regular basis. Baseball can be played every day. Hockey, basketball, they're all more daily sports. But football was always a weekly sport, so very popular. So then the individuals in the league would create an imaginary team using real players. And then when those real players would play a game, they would earn points. So if you had, let's see, we're in North Carolina, so we're going to use the Carolina Panthers. So if Cam Newton threw a touchdown pass to Christian McCaffrey, Cam Newton would earn points for throwing that touchdown pass. Christian McCaffrey would earn points for catching the ball. The players would earn points based upon how they performed. At the end of the day, whoever's team had scored the most points would win the game. So that was season long. You would keep track of your standings, just like sports teams do. And at the end of the season, maybe there would be a trophy. Maybe there would be a prize. It was just a fun way to stay connected with college friends, people in the office, people in a book club. It could be anything. And this is what the fantasy sports example of scoring would look like. A touchdown gives you 6 points. If you kick a field goal, you get 3 points. And you can just see that list right there. And obviously, if you throw an interception or if you lose a fumble, that's negative points. So it's a very complex scoring system. But that was a form of fantasy sports that was fun. But the makers of DraftKings wanted to come up with something else that would kind of be more interactive. And this happened after the poker site started getting shut down back in 2000, between 10 and 14. And what they found was we can take fantasy sports contests, and instead of having a full season-long event that took 4 months to decide a winner, how about we just let people draft their players every day or every week? They can make a new team. And so what this became was almost an accelerated version of fantasy sports contests. So now instead of me having one team that I would have for the entire 16-week football season, every Sunday I could draft a new team and I could submit that lineup against thousands of other people from around the country. And we could play for really big prizes. And I'm talking tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And this took off. Daily fantasy sports allows a person to constantly draft a new team, but then with that comes the constant preoccupation, the research, the analysis. It's a huge business, and there's many games to choose from. Not only is it just the sports aspect, we have to realize that this is a booming business for weather people. You say, why weather people? Well, if you're going to pick a player in, say, a baseball game, and you find out that there's a storm at that stadium in the city where the stadium is located, and it's a very windy day, you may not want to maybe pick that player if the wind is blowing in from the outfield and they may not be able to hit too many home runs. That's the level of analysis that fantasy sports participants will study. They'll study the weather. They'll study trends and analysis. This takes a lot of time. It's a lot of preoccupation. It's almost, for anyone who's ever struggled with addiction, it's that preoccupation of thinking about how you'll get the next fix, where you'll get it from, when you'll get it. It's all of those questions. The same thing applies here. So now you've taken something that was a fun hobby and you've drilled it down and you're rewarding it on a more frequent basis, and also you're shortening that time horizon that a person gets a reward. So what's the relationship? If fantasy sports is not considered gambling, it certainly feels like it, because you're spending money on the outcome of sporting events. You're risking something of value to win something of value. You're rewarding the outcome faster, as I mentioned before. There's promises of a big payout. DraftKings has a Sunday contest called the Millie Maker. The winner gets $1 million. These are big prizes. And you get real-time feedback. So you can track your team and your roster real time. You can actually see if you're winning in real time. And if you're winning, you'll have a little dollar sign with the amount of money you're winning. So you can track that real time. It's amazing what we see when we see fantasy sports contests and how in-depth people can really take it. So a study was done in New Jersey for daily fantasy sports players. And what they were looking at, this was done in 2018. They were looking to identify kind of who the fantasy sports players are with respect to problem gambling, gambling behaviors. And what they did was they took over 3,600 residents aged 18 plus, and they identified that what was most predictive of the daily fantasy sports players, they tended to also engage in a higher number of gambling activities. They also played at an increased frequency. So now what you have is you have something where people are online picking their rosters, following fantasy sports. But in New Jersey, we've also had online internet gambling since 2013. So the individual is also very comfortable with the online gambling component. And they're also very familiar with the online websites that are connected to casinos. So this is a demographic, typically male, as you see. But what was also interesting is that they were single, and also being of Hispanic heritage was interesting. I have not had a chance to dive into that a little bit further, but that was an area that I would like to dive into and understand a little bit more. And also being male. So we know sports gamblers and skill-based gamblers tend to be males. Females tend to be passive gamblers. That still applies. So it's interesting that this kind of reinforces those assumptions. They're not always correct, but that's the generalization that we've come to see. So we do understand connection between daily fantasy sports and gambling. But now let's take it back a step further. So if we're looking at fantasy sports and there's gambling components or aspects to that, now we have to go even earlier and younger, and let's look at video gaming. Because many of us are seeing video games are a bit concerning. It could be concerning from the use of screen time. It could be concerning from the content or the elements of a game that might become violent, or how it treats other people, or the language. There could be many different areas. But what we want to take a look at here is what's the connection between video gaming and gambling? Well, within the video gaming world, there's really two types of gamers. You have gamers that will come home from school or come home from work and just play video games on a console or on their phone for hours on end with no goal in sight. They're just playing a game, and they want to do well in the game. They want to have fun. They want to escape. They want to relieve boredom. They want to socially connect with others. Whatever it is, they're just gaming for hours. Then you have esports. And esports is a new phenomenon that is simply understood as competitive video gaming in real time. And so you can watch these tournaments and these events on TV. You can watch them live stream on your computer, on websites such as Mixer or Twitch or YouTube Gaming, many different sites. But these tournaments, these esports tournaments, you can actually wager on other people playing video games. In New Jersey, you have under the legislation that you can wager on esports tournaments. It falls under the sports betting legislation. So I can now bet on some 18-year-old or a 21-year-old who's playing a video game tournament. I don't know anything about this. This is not my world. But if it's out there, you could almost gamble on pretty much anything. So this is now something that we're starting to see, that people wagering on video gaming tournaments. But the people who also play video games, they also get used to spending money on the games on which they play. And that can be concerning, because at a fundamental level, when you normalize spending money on a game at an early age, you're almost normalizing the spending money on a game when you go to the casino when you turn 21. It's a game you play where your skill impacts the outcome, and you can spend money to try to win money. We're seeing that now among 14-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 17-year-olds. Come 21, they're already familiar with the concept of spending money to make money or spending money on entertainment of a game. And so we have to be very careful and just aware of the fact that gambling elements are contained within video games, and those things are called loot boxes. Robbie, I want to pause a second here because I want to make sure people are following.
Sure.
Is there a way that we can just do a kind of a show of hands response to say how many people have heard of a loot box or are familiar with loot boxes?
Sure. Yeah, guys, if you look, you can raise your hand, I believe in the Q&A, or just chat. Oh, here we go. Okay. Do you see that, Dan? I don't know if you can see the participants raising their hand who have heard of, and it's climbing as I speak, who have heard of loot boxes. And I will say, Dan, that we do cover this, and Allison's covered it in some of the training. So if those folks have been in our trainings, they probably have heard we introduced them to this, even during SureBet, I believe, too. But
Awesome.
We're up to 9 participants here, and one chatted.
And what was that chat?
Let me take a look here. Okay. Oh, yes. Jeanette is saying she knows. Thumbs up. She knows about that. Let me look at the Q&A here. Oh, it says someone's listening, but they cannot see anyone. Well, no, that's. I hope you can see the slides. So it looks like so far we've got about 10 folks who are saying that they have heard of loot boxes.
Good. So that means that then I want to say there's also a number of people who haven't. So I want to make sure I cover, because there's a lot of information, and I don't want to just assume that people are familiar. So a loot box is an item that exists within video games that contains something of value. And what I mean by that is that a gamer can spend a few dollars and purchase this digital crate or this digital box that looks really cool. And it contains some digital items. And those digital items typically are called skins. A skin is something that you decorate a weapon, you decorate your character. Bringing it to the real world, they used to sell skins for cell phones to make your phone look cooler. Kids, when they're jeweling, they would buy a skin for their jewel so that the jewel could look cooler. It's something that makes whatever you have just look cooler. It doesn't impact the game whatsoever. So that's what a loot box contains. Now, sometimes a loot box will contain something that's rare, a very rare item, or it could just contain something that's very common and basic. So this is important amongst primarily teens. We find 12 to 17, it really matters how cool their character looks like. And the games glamorize these things. They'll say, hey, you can win this really rare black cape that your character can have. And so kids will spend money on these things to try to win these things. The problem is that the psychology of a loot box was based upon the psychology of a slot machine. So you're going to spend a certain amount of money to try to win something of value. The problem is you don't know how often you're going to win it. You don't know when it's going to happen next, and you don't know how much you're going to win. So that psychology means that you're going to spend money on these loot boxes, and you might just win a bunch of common random items that really aren't worth much. That's like, did you really win anything at all? That's actually called, in the gaming world, that's a loss disguised as a win. That's the phrase, a loss disguised as a win. Because you really didn't win anything of value, but it appears that you did because you're getting something back. Think of a slot machine. You put $2 in and you get 10 cents back. Well, yeah, you won something nominal. You won 10 cents, but you lost $1.90. So that's a loss disguised as a win. The lights go off, the bells go off, it makes a sound, it says winner, but you really didn't win much of anything. Similar concept. So loot boxes don't necessarily, contents don't impact the outcome of the game, and therefore we find kids that start risking something of value to win something of value. I was just in Pittsburgh the last couple of days, and I did a couple of seminars, and the number of kids that spend money on games, one of the questions I asked was, what's the most amount of money you've spent on a game in one day? And the consensus, what I found more than 30 to 40% of the time was that kids were spending more than $50 on a game in any given day. And it wasn't just once. This was probably about once a week. So they're spending money on these things, whether it's work money, birthday money, Christmas money, Hanukkah money, holiday money, whatever it might be. And then their parents' money too. And a number of them indicated that their parents were not happy and didn't understand why they'd spend so much money. And a couple of them even indicated that their parents just cut the credit card off because it was getting a little bit out of hand. So we see this normalization of spending money is a concern, okay? There was research in the UK that noted that video game playing was often a precursor to slot machine playing because the philosophy is keep playing as long as possible. And that's what we see with video games. You know what's interesting? We talk about people with a gambling problem. They tend to fall into that chasing mode. They're just chasing. They're not always chasing the money. They're chasing a feeling. They're chasing an accomplishment. They're trying to chase maybe getting another free spin so they can get to the next level, whatever it is with some of the progressive slot machine games. But in video gaming, people chase also. They chase high scores. They try to chase that next best item that they can decorate their character. And there's really no end to video game playing. You can just keep playing and playing. You don't pass out. You don't overdose. Just like gambling, you don't pass out. You don't overdose. Substance use is different. You can only consume so much alcohol or drug in your body before there's a negative reaction. And so it's slightly different when you look at process addictions or a process component like gaming and gambling, where you can just continue to go basically until you fall asleep. So what does early exposure to gaming or gambling do to a child? Well, a couple things we always want to be aware of. We want to be aware of that immediate gratification. You're getting real-time feedback, and it feels really good when someone's telling you immediately, like, yes, you've succeeded. You don't have to guess. You don't have to wait. You know exactly real-time if you're winning or losing and how you're playing the game. When kids game with others, that social connection is huge. But by having the inability to wait, you're also having an inability to develop patience or control. And that's concerning because with the developing brain, we know risk-taking, we understand decision-making. Now, all of a sudden, young people expect an answer or expect immediate gratification across multiple areas of life. They want instant feedback constantly. They're getting it from Instagram. They're getting it from social media. They know if they get likes. They know if they get comments. And so do adults. I don't mean to just say it's young people. Some of us can also struggle with that as well. But when you have this desire or this you're getting used to immediate gratification, well, then we're missing out on refining some other areas of our life, like patience and control. Also, as I mentioned before, the early exposure or a big win can be a predictor to future problems for gambling. So we said before that two of the biggest predictors is age of onset and not seeing the negatives. It's really hard to talk to someone young about how bad all the stuff can be when they don't have lived experience. They also probably don't have a lot of peers that talk about it much or that they can relate to. We find that peers learn best from peers. That's why a cop-to-cop program works so well, peer-to-peer program works so well, learning from others. So when you can be in a room with a bunch of youth and have youth share with other youth, that becomes very powerful. The other area that we're really showing that kids are learning, they're learning that speed and action just dominates the brain. The brain is in constant overdrive. I was thinking about my son about this because he plays baseball, plays soccer, plays sports, so he gets outside a heck of a lot, thankfully. But when he does play games on his Xbox, I'm fascinated that he'll play the game, he'll have his headset on talking to his friend through the gaming, through the headset, and at the same time, he'll have his phone next to him watching YouTube while he's playing the game. So he's not only playing a game, he's also watching something else and he's interacting with his friend. There's a lot going on there. Talk about multitasking. That's craziness. But kids are consuming media and consuming technology like never before. And that's where the parents almost need to kind of step in a way. And that's where balance and moderation really comes into play. One area that I've noticed also among teens is they really get into that flow state. The brain gets into a flow state where they lose track of time really easily. And so some parents complain that they'll give their child a 1 hour time limit. And when the 1 hour is up, the child's angry and agitated and frustrated, saying that it wasn't an hour. It wasn't an hour. Why are you stopping me so early? I still have more time. The hour was up. And when you're so engrossed in something, you almost just enter this flow state where you just lose track of time. And so one of the indicators I always mention to parents is, hey, give your child a reference point 30 minutes in. Say, hey, 30 minutes left. Because that's going to almost kind of shake them out of that flow state to give them a reference point in time. It's good to have those. As speakers, anyone that has spoken to a group, in the back of the room sometimes, there'll be a little sign that's held up. Hey, 5 minutes left, 10 minutes left. It's the same concept. Sometimes you get into a flow state and you lose track of time. It's not just for kids. It can happen to adults too. So esports, you can see from this image here, you have the Staples Center, you have arenas where you can go and watch people play video games. You can root for them. You can cheer them on. You can have your favorite team and just, absorb it all. It's like an event. It's just like a sporting event, okay? So these are professional gaming events, and it's gaining speed. Among people who play games, 40% watch live streams at least once per week. That should say at least, not at least. I'm sorry about that. 25% of gamers who watch esports tune in for more than 4 hours per week. So they're not just playing games. They also like watching other people play games. And what's interesting is 2/3 of them just love reality TV or competition shows, which is an offshoot of the esports gaming contest about reality, about competition. So what's the future? Wow. Well, the Olympic Committee is certainly exploring this because we have athletes, and they are considered athletes. They're considered esports athletes. And the question is, will the Olympics make this an athletic competition? Colleges and universities are now offering scholarships. This is a cultural phenomenon. You can be a part of a team in middle school, and then you can go to high school and be a part of a team which plays competitive video gaming, okay, on a team level, and you can try to earn a college scholarship. Also, colleges are now offering degrees in esports management. You can start your own league and how you run this league. So this is a sign of the times. It's not right or wrong. It's just an evolution that now competitive video gaming is viewed as an athletic contest and offered through colleges and universities and through the NCAA. Robbie, I think this is a good spot here because I know we have about 15, 20 minutes. I want to just pause and ask if anyone has a question about gaming or esports.
Yes, Dan, I was going to interrupt and say, yes, speaking about flow of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's been great.
I got it on my watch.
You know what I'm
That's
saying?
So funny.
And speaking of that, we did get a great chat right around that time as well. And this comes from, I've just got a phone number here. So several parents had to remove the whole gaming system, including me, to help the teen get college applications. Oh, that's from Lynn. Thank you, Lynn. So yeah, Lynn said that she had to remove her whole gaming system, including herself, to help her teen get their college. So that's a comment there.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions. So while I'm reading through a couple of these guys, please, shoot a chat or a quick question while we're at this point, and perhaps for Dan and any of the things that he's covered this far, and we could get to it. Let's see here. And then an anonymous attendee says, I have not heard of it, so I don't know exactly. That was about at 30 minutes in. So that perhaps could have been at esports, but yeah. So yeah, are there any questions on any of the subject matter Dan spoke on? And while we're waiting, I have to say, Dan, I really liked the loot box example you were talking about, because I never thought of that, frankly, that it works off the slot machine. It has that slot machine connection, the loss disguised as a win, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was nicely put. I use the same example Julie Hines had used. I remember back in the 70s when I was young, going to those old, where the gumball machines are in those big, supermarket stores. And it was the anticipation of why I went back every Sunday with Mom to try to get $1 worth of quarters so I could crack open one of those big oblong, plastic containers to see what was in there. And every time it was something that disappointed me, but I kept going back. So yeah. So, but no, that was a nice connection. So here's another chat. Loot boxes were huge in in Fortnite, and Fortnite was ginormous. That comes from Jeanette.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of video games have that, and it really started with Star Wars Battlefront is what really launched this whole conversation about loot boxes, because when Star Wars came out with their game, with EA Sports came out with the Star Wars themed game, they almost required players to purchase loot boxes to advance through the game. And that was a bit concerning, because now you're almost forcing people to spend the money. Otherwise, you could have gotten through the game, but it might take you 40 or 60 or 80 hours of grinding it out. Or you could try to get loot boxes to win certain weapons to advance faster. That really brought this storm of pay to play, so to speak, in video games. Most games, though, just use loot boxes as cosmetic items to make someone look cooler. And then for a 12 to 17-year-old, it matters. It's ego boosting. It makes you feel good. It's your identity. And a lot of kids have their identity through their avatar and through the way they play video gaming today.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. All right. We've got one more question here that they're asking, are stating, I heard of an inpatient video gaming treatment trend in Asia. Has this taken hold in the US yet? Do you know anything about that? Yep.
Yeah, so in the last check that I had heard in Asia, South Asia, there were up to 10 inpatient gaming facilities for those struggling with gaming. In the United States, so take a step back. The World Health Organization last year identified gaming as a formal disorder. Under the ICD-11, which was the International Classification of Diseases, 11th revision, they named gaming as a formal disorder according to the WHO. The United States follows the DSM, and we're on DSM-5, which does not have gaming recognized as a formal disorder. It's under review in the appendices from 2013. Now, in the United States, there is one facility I know of that has gotten the most press on the West Coast. It's called Restart or Restart Life. It's one of those two, and it's a private pay inpatient facility that can cost upwards of $60,000 for whatever the stay is, 30 to 60 day stay. And their goal is to try to help someone detox off the gaming, also start encouraging better eating habits, so nutrition, exercise, and teach an individual responsible technology use, because you can't avoid technology, but they want to teach people how to use it responsibly. The other great resource, and I have to always mention, is Cam Adair, who's been out to North Carolina. I'm sure many of you know Cam. And he speaks around the country, and he has his Game Quitters website, which has a lot of great information and questions that you can ask to find out if gaming is becoming a problem in your life or for a loved one. So those are two great, that's a great resource, and the other one is the inpatient.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I didn't know about that place on the West Coast. Thanks for letting us know that. And I would imagine it would have to be private pay, right? With where it's at in the DSM-5. Yeah, so.
Exactly. So we'll move through the final slides here as we're at 12:46 or so. So we'll go another 10 or so and get through the rest. Would that be all right?
Sounds good.
Okay. So esports, as we wrap up, huge audience, huge revenue, a global industry. And as I mentioned, it's competitive video gaming in real time. Just wanted to go back over, we talked about gambling mechanics in gaming. Well, let's take a look at some of them. We talked about the losses disguised as wins as one, but look at cognitive entrapment. So that's also considered your sunk cost bias. And what this really means is that you've already invested a certain amount of time in this game. You might as well just continue. So for someone who's spent hours and hours in a game, they become very vested in that game. And you're almost trapped in this thinking that I've already sunk a lot of time, energy, perhaps money in this investment, in this thing. So now I'm just going to stay committed to this. So even though it might be causing negative consequences, it continues despite those negative consequences. That's the concept of a sunk cost bias. We see that happen in gambling establishments as well. Once you've started a progressive slot machine game where you're trying to get to a next level or get a certain number of free spins, you're committed and you have a sunk cost in that. Your money's already there. Same thing can apply in games. Another item we want to be aware of is the illusion of control. People tend to think they have better chances of winning when they're given the chance to pick or select something on their own because they think there's an element of skill in that. This is really, you see this with sports bettors and you see this with horse racing fans, is that if they can study and they can pick, then they'll tend to think that their skill is better than the next person and that they have a higher chance of winning because of their skill or because of their knowledge. That's that illusion of control. Chasing. So a gambler who chases could be chasing a feeling, could be chasing a loss. For gamers, they could be chasing a high score. They could be chasing the investment of time and money. So there's a chase component to gaming as well, just like there is for gambling. So the risks with gaming, well, what we're seeing here is that there could potentially lead to some problem gambling behaviors or activities. We understand it's a bigger concern among youth because that's who the demographic that's primarily targeted. But we also talked about the earlier one starts an activity, the higher likelihood to develop a problem if it's not moderated. The fourth bullet down is one that I always love using. It's just that simple concept that the brain develops the gas pedal faster than the braking system. I think this is just so spot on, and we use this a lot. You know, kids want to go, 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 and our job is to say, whoa, 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 slow down, okay? And that's where you get that brain development. So it's important to always remember that gas pedal braking system analogy. And then we also realize that other risks with gaming, that inability to delay gratification, to control the impact on time and money, the sense of identity and belonging. Because we see a lot of kids that want to belong. They want to feel like they fit in. When I was in Pittsburgh 2 days ago, there was a mother who would not let her son play Fortnite at all. She is of the mind that all video games are evil, they're bad, and there's not one ounce of positivity that can come from video games, and that's her opinion, which she's entitled to. That's fine. And we did talk after, and I was kind of sharing my view on some of these things. But what she indicated was that she wants to rethink her decision because by not letting her son play Fortnite at school, he's isolated. He's not a part of those conversations. Other kids don't talk to him. So now he eats lunch by himself or maybe with one other kid. He feels more isolated from the group and he just he's not developing friends. He feels a little shy. It's kind of building. He doesn't know where he fits in or where he belongs. And she's starting to see that. So it's interesting that a parent will say, I have a very strong feeling and exclude their child from that. But then what is the impact to that child? You know, where is there a middle ground where maybe he can play the game an hour a day? You know, it's a family decision. It's not my decision. But it's interesting that she's starting to see the effects of that decision now trickle down to her son. Problematic cognitions with gaming. Well, if someone has a substance use problem or a gambling problem and they start playing a game, you know what's fascinating is there are games out there that will appeal to anybody. And if you take a game like Grand Theft Auto, which is massively popular, you can drink in that game, you can do drugs, you can gamble. Imagine someone in recovery from some of that stuff can now live out their fantasies through video games. And that could be kind of concerning. So when you're gaming, you can almost allow some of the behaviors that were associated with your gambling or your drinking or your substance use, you can actually allow those to hang around longer from playing certain games. And then with gaming, no time spent is ever enough. We talked about that before. You can gain your power, your status, but gaming also allows you to escape. But for kids, what I found is interesting, gaming allows them to fail. Gaming is a safe place for some kids. When it's done in moderation, it allows them to escape, it allows them to relax and unwind, and it allows them to feel as if they have a safe place to experiment, a safe place to fail, a safe place to try, because if it doesn't work out, the ramifications are not much of anything. But in real life, it could be more severe. So some kids just like to game just because there's no real life implications when it's done in moderation. The quote here I love, the phrase that's highlighted is a digital dopamine drip. So the goal of companies producing video games is to identify, harvest, and mine the motivation of gamers while administering the digital dopamine drip they crave. Wow. See, that's a powerful phrase, digital dopamine drip, because we see that across the board, not just on gaming. We see that on social media. We see that when somebody posts something on social media and they get likes and comments. That's a digital dopamine drip. It feels really good. So, impact of today's youth that we talked about throughout the day. It's free oftentimes. It gives them the chance to spend some money if they want. It provides an escape, social connection, measurable growth. It can give someone purpose and meaning. But the problem is, though, is you also get a dopamine overload. And now all of a sudden, some of the behaviors associated with the game, and you have that sunk cost bias that we talked about that kind of keeps you involved. But as we said, it's a safe place to play, experiment, and fail. So as we wrap up here, it would not be March without talking about sports betting. And you can see in the top right, March Madness. So March is National Problem Gambling Awareness Month. And so we have to talk about sports betting. And as we close today, I want to talk about 3 things for online sports betting that might be coming to North Carolina soon. It's coming across the country, state by state, some slower than others. But over time, I could see sports betting in a majority of states around the country. And we want to take a look at 3 things: device, the in-play betting, and a cash-out feature. So the device or platform, this is critical because you don't always have to go to a physical brick-and-mortar location to play sports bets. In New Jersey, since 2013, we've had mobile device gambling. And in 2018, when we legalized sports betting, it was almost immediately available on websites. If there was a website set up, if there was a company that had access, they did it. And what this does basically is that you now have a sports bookie in your pocket 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's convenient, it's portable, it's subtle, it's easy to use, it's real-time information. And in New Jersey, over 85% of all sports wagers are done online. So people are really embracing this technology. Now, sports gambling has changed to something called in-play sports betting. Sports betting used to be primarily betting a team to win, like University of North Carolina is going to beat Duke or vice versa, whatever your preference is. You put a bet on the game is over, you either win or lose your bet. That's traditional sports betting. You're betting on a game with a point spread or whatever it might be. Now, when you have sports betting done via the internet, you can make a bet on that same game. And let's say you bet North Carolina to beat Duke. Well, halfway through the game, maybe North Carolina is actually winning that game. The company you bet through on your phone will give you an offer to close out your bet. So you can make bets now during the game. You can make bets on who's going to score the next basket. You're going to make bets on how many points will be scored in the third quarter. You can make all these bets in play, a lot of bets. You can just keep betting throughout the game. But then, over time, you might be given the option to cash out your bet early. And take a look at this first phrase. Cash out lets you take a profit early if your bet's coming in. What that means is that if you have a bet that's winning, they're going to give you an offer. Think of the show Deal or No Deal. That show Deal or No Deal with Howie Mandel would be great on TV, and the banker would give an offer, and the person could decide, do they want to take the banker's offer now, or do they want to keep pressing their luck and wait until the end? This is a very similar concept. So you can choose to cash out your bet and close it and take your money early. You would get a slightly lesser amount because you're taking it out before the contest is done, or you can let it continue to go. But what's interesting is if you look at the description of cash out, it almost looks like it's investing. Because if you look at this first sentence, cash out lets you take the profit earlier if your bet's coming in, or you get some of your stake back if your bet is going against you. It doesn't say you're losing. It says your bet's going against you. So that's interesting psychologically. You know, no one wants to be a loser. It's just not going how I thought it was. And so it's funny when you look at the marketing of these features as well. And then this is based on live market prices. Well, now all of a sudden, sports betting almost looks and feels like skillful money management. That if I have a bet that's winning, I'm going to close it out. I'm going to take some of my profits, and now I'm going to look to bet on something else. And all of a sudden, it changes the look and feel of sports betting from a gambling type behavior to almost something that's more looking like an investing or a skillful money management practice. It's fascinating how this is being marketed and what we're seeing in New Jersey. So I had to make mention of those three things. The device, so it's online, in-play betting. You can bet on a large number of things during a sports contest, and then you have the option to cash out early if your bet is winning. So we always have to be, as we close out here, the summary, we've covered things like illusion of control, skill versus luck. Intermittent reinforcement is the big premise of a lot of what we talk about. Every so often you win, whether it's video games, every so often you get something valuable in a loot box, whether it's sports betting, you might have a bet that's winning, you can cash it out early, whether it's actual gambling that every so often you do win on a slot machine or any other type of game. And then when you have social proofing, others are doing it. If you see other people doing it, you're more likely to try it yourself. The scarcity principle, act now, act fast. Sometimes we see that in video games where people are given an option to buy something, but they have to decide in the next 2 minutes. Otherwise, they're going to miss that opportunity. And we know the near miss is the hook of all of this. It's that feeling that I'm so close. It's that dopamine response of anticipating a win, and I'm so close that I want to do it again if I don't win. So what are the 5 E's of why people gamble? Excitement, entertainment, escape, the economics, and that ego. And the 5 A's to the perfect storm of gambling, we have to be aware of the age, the availability, the acceptability, advertising, and access. And last but not least, keep it fun. So for anyone who knows of someone with a gambling problem or has questions about what does responsible gambling look like, how do we keep it fun? You always gamble for fun and not for profit. You set your limits, spending only what you can afford. Don't chase, don't take out more money, take your breaks, don't consume drugs or excessive amounts of alcohol. If you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, don't gamble. Take care of those basic needs first. And also, always know the resources. Robbie, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We're at 12:59.
Well, that was right on, Dan. Yeah, that good stuff. No, very great. We do have maybe if we could just maybe run a minute or two over, if that's okay, Dan. We've got a quick question, but no, that was wonderful. Good stuff. Yeah, the question is, hey, is it possible to copy the presentation? So, yes, thank you, Dan. We'll post that on the UNC Springboard website. No, very good stuff, Dan, and we appreciate it. And I'll give you fair warning. Talking about Duke and North Carolina in this state is kind of like a Yankees Red Sox thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, I was warned the same way, so, but no. And this is always ever changing too, I will say, with the states, with North Carolina, they did pass a bill. So sports gambling is legal there, or here in North Carolina. So, and I believe it's live now. So, so it is a big thing. And we were so happy to get your insight on all this and your expertise. I know that I learned quite a bit. I do have a quick question regarding fantasy and what your take would be on this, in closing with the fantasy sports being, it's kind of funny, and you said it's kind of a moot point with it being legal now, but would you think the fantasy sports like DraftKings and those companies, do you think that they would want to be now considered gambling to open up more opportunities?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's two different ways. I think they can create new types of games if they're considered gambling, because they can probably integrate it better between a daily fantasy sports contest and actual sports gambling, so that you can bet on the number of points that Tom Brady will score versus the number of points LeBron James scores or something. And you can now combine fantasy elements into sports betting. Maybe you make that a parlay, a teaser, a straight bet. You can start combining more things that way. So it could open up more product offering. I know from our perspective of helping people, I would love to see it all treated the same, because from a self-exclusion perspective and from a regulatory perspective, it's easier than to help people stay recovered when they sign up for self-exclusion from gambling, fantasy sports would also be considered. Right now, if it's not considered gambling, a person can still play daily fantasy sports, even though they're self-excluded from gambling activities, if fantasy sports is not considered gambling. You see what I'm saying there? It makes it harder, and then the marketing gets confusing because now you can have someone, and this is what's happening in New Jersey, someone will be signed up from self-exclusion for gambling, yet they'll still receive marketing advertisements to open up a fantasy site, to open up a fantasy account. Wow. And then once they have a fantasy account opened, they receive solicitations to now open a sports betting account because fantasy is not considered gambling, so they can market to them differently. It makes it very difficult. So I would like to see it considered gambling for that reason.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, that's exactly. I think they can piggyback a whole lot of things, and it's kind of like they went quiet when the sports gambling thing. It's changing every day now. But now they're saying, hey, okay, we are gambling now. Where it was such a to-do 7 years ago. Hey, this isn't gambling, so that they could stay and play and not be regulated. And now if it is, I would see it being regulated, right? So, okay. Well, listen, man, I again, as always, great insight, very well put. And we appreciate you coming on, and we look forward to the next one. So there'll be a recorded version of this, folks, on the UNC Springboard website, behavioral health website. And please look forward to next Thursday, where my subject matter will be talking on assessing and screening for problem gambling and gambling disorder.
Great.
Dan, thank you again. And
good stuff.
Everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Dan. All right.
Bye-bye.